Hello and welcome to my recap of round 11 of the 2024 FIDE candidates. This recap being a little bit delayed as I was busy with poker stuff earlier in the day. But yeah, it was a very exciting round, and we will see in this first game between Gukesh and Caruana, the Caruana played this move 97 on move 4, which is not the most common line, but if we go to around this point, we'll see that basically Caruana was trying to get a fighting position and to create some winning chances, given that he's somewhat behind Nepo and Gukesh going into this round. Now, a normal continuation would just be to play something like Bishop e7 and put the rook on e8 and basically prepare a move like knight e4 over the next moves, which, turns out wouldn't actually lose a pawn because black is, defending the e4 knight enough times with the recapture. But rather than playing it in the classical way, Caruana went for the move of g5 and then knight to h5 to take the bishop pair advantage and force some imbalance in the position. The play continued pretty normally for both sides. Castles, knight b6, queen to c2, and there isn't really anything for black in going h5, h4, because white's just going to be too fast for his play in the center. So black simply castles, and white goes for the standard minority attack with b4, which is aiming to try to isolate the black queenside pawns and create some weaknesses. The thing is, if you play the move b5 a bit too fast, black's going to go c5 in many cases and bring his bishop on g7 into the game. So Gukesh keeps attention with rook b1. Bishop e6, a4 was played to kick away the knight. Now, one thing with the minority attack is that in some cases a minority attack will be less effective when black can put the knight into c4, which is the move the computer recommends here. Nonetheless, after takes, and b5, we can still make the point that because white's structure is a lot more flexible than black's, it does mean the position is a bit easier for white to play, but still this is probably the way that black should have played it. Because in the game, after knight d7, a5, with ideas of a6 to weaken the structure, and now to move a6, even though this stops the b5 pawn break and closes the queen side, the problem is after Gukesh's move of knight a4 and knight c5, well, now the pressure on b7 is quite unpleasant, and that's also true after takes and bc5 that was played in a game, where black's queenside majority is not only useless for creating a passed pawn, but the b7 pawn is even the target. So black played the move of f5. If you don't play f5, white's just going to play bishop f5 himself and, just completely dominate the light squares as such. So you kind of have to play f5 here as black. White played a move queen c3, which is certainly reasonable to support the knight coming in at e5. But there was also an argument to play king h2 and very creatively play rook h1, king back to g1. If you are wondering why there are some arrows, it's because I did a recording earlier and the computer crashed after a few minutes, like it couldn't take the heat. But yeah, basically after queen to c3, black continued building up with rook f7. All this is fairly normal. Rook b4. Queen c7, yeah, attacking the pawn. Maybe not the most precise, but there were admittedly some sort of bigger games in this one that we will get to in the recap. Speaking of which, if you are enjoying the recap, do make sure to like the video and also to consider subscribing. Now, the reason that white played knight e5 in this position directly is that if you wait a move, say king h2, then black will just play bishop to c8, covering e5 with the bishop, and then it's going to be kind of difficult to make progress without a pawn break in the position. So white goes knight e5 to resolve that issue. Take. And yeah, the pawn is doubled, but white can defend it with f4, as it happened on the very next move. And after queen d8, we reach kind of one of the key positions of the game where white could have played something like rook fb1, prompting a move like bishop c8 or rook e7. And then, you can even consider taking, which will sort of be a slightly better version of what we'll see in the game. Because in the game, white played the immediate fg5, which might look very anti-positional at first to give yourself two sets of doubled isolated pawns. But black also has weaknesses on b7 and f5 that are much easier to get at when the position opens up. Black played queen g7, we had rook bf2 switching to this weakness, now that b7 is covered. Bishop d7, and this was probably the last chance for white to try to get any sort of advantage, where probably white has to play to move queen b2 and hit this pawn in order to have something, because if black does defend with bishop c8, we do have bishop f5 and we are able to get at it in this way as such. well, after queen takes e5, we're able to take on b7, and taking the pawn a5 as natural as it looks doesn't really work for black here, as after bishop f5, we're actually not losing a piece after bishop takes, because we have the move queen c6 hitting the rook and the f5 bishop, and if black tries to defend both at once, say if he plays rook to c8, we can just play queen h6 and we are going to win the bishop back, say rook cf8, queen g5. We're going to take the piece back and have very decent winning chances in this endgame as such, where we do have an extra pawn in this case. Maybe it's not enough to win, but definitely you can try to make something of it at the very least. But in the game, white played the move queen b4 instead, and this allowed black to play bishop c8. And the difference, in case you're wondering, of having the queen on b2 versus on b4 means that in this version, if the queen was on b2, we just cover this e5 pawn and just be doing very well. But here, black can simply take with rook takes e5 and just basically force a draw on the queen ending, because the white king is now just way too exposed. And the game ended queen c6, queen e1, and we had a free-fall repetition, and the game ended in a draw. So maybe the least interesting game of the round, objectively speaking, but still have a few kind of moments from an instructional value, where Gukesh should have some small chance set problems, but perhaps didn't make the most of them, let's say. Now, this game between Firouzja and Abbasov almost features, you could say, Firouzja 2.0, where rather than trying to play mainline set problems, he's just playing knight f3 and b3 against everything and just trying to get a position on the board to play. And it worked, given that he won this game, but let's see how he won it. I have to say, actually, the way he approached it with this whole d4, knight takes d4, very similar to like a blitz style of chess, like the way Nakamura likes to play 1b3, for example, online, and, has done so to get to be the best blitz player on chess.com. Actually, interesting, because he even won the title Tuesday quite recently on Tuesday. But anyway, after d5, knight d2, all this is pretty standard. c4, and ready to move rook d8 might be a little bit of an inaccuracy here, where a more direct approach like playing e5 first might be indicated as such, and then rook d8 probably works a little bit better, because in this version white does have the extra option to play c5 and to kind of play for this blockade on the dark squares, just sort of making it hard for black to find a really good pawn break in a sense. But the game saw cd5. Firouzja decided to just keep a more kind of simple position on the board, where black has sort of more chance, I guess, where basically black is playing only for a draw in a position like this. Maybe you could argue that perhaps b5 is a better square for the queen, preparing to develop the bishop without losing the pawn on b7. But in the game, queen f5 was played, and after knight e8, and now nice move of rook c5. Well, here black has to be quite accurate to avoid a very difficult position, where what black probably had to do was just play the move queen to e6 and just kind of accept these a tiny bit worse because of the passive bishop. But then black can sort of consolidate, can play moves like queen b6, get a bishop out with a tempo, and that should more or less be playable for black. In the game, e5 just ended up being too ambitious, where black was obviously hoping that the bishop would just retreat, and that therefore white would lose some of his initiative. But because of the pin on the pawn, white's not forced to retreat. You can just play the move knight c4 as in the game, and it's very hard for black to deal with this pin, because say you play a move like f6, for example, which is actually what happened in the game. Well, the problem is that rook d5, and now there's a threat on the rook. If you try to keep the tension with bishop e6, white can even just play e4 and just kind of run the black queen out of the squares in a sense. If they go rook takes d5 as in the game, then you take, and white just has a massive advantage. Like, black basically has a space disadvantage because we've taken advantage of the squares that black has left behind. The bishop and the rook are playing, just completely not playing in the game at all. Even after queen d7 defending the pawn, we can still see here that black still doesn't have a good way to develop his bishop and rook. And while the move rook b8 is a bit of a blunder, it's also kind of true that, this is kind of a lost position. Like, even queen c7 and queen d5, we can see how, black still isn't able to develop his bishop. And, without two pieces in the game, it's pretty clear that, white is going to win one way or the other. So rook b8, just kind of accelerate at the end. Bishop a7, rook a8, knight b6, and at this point after rook d8, black is losing a piece by force, and therefore he resigned here. A very crushing game by Ferrugia, and also true that Barcelona definitely didn't play at his best in this game, to put it mildly. But it does show kind of the advantage of playing the non-theoretical approach, just playing kind of simple, healthy chess. It putting getting the opponent their own resources earlier does mean that they're more likely to make mistakes sooner, and it is round 11 of a long tournament. So it makes sense that the players are starting to, get a little bit tired at this point. And that sort of came into play a little bit with some of the next games we'll see as well, in fact. Because with this win, actually, now Nakamura is in second place, equal with Gukesh. If you're wondering why second place, well, we'll see what happens in the last game. But yeah, for this one, the funny thing is, I don't think Nakamura was actually playing for a win in this game. Because when he plays the move c5, it's kind of clear that, Black is just playing to make a draw with this approach. Whereas a move like e6 keeps a lot more tension in the position, of course, like we saw in the Gukesh Caruana game earlier. But up to e5, the sort of idea of this is that, well, first of all, if dc5, Black does have e6 and can get the pawn back in this way. Because like b4, a5, the position proves to be overextended for White. When he can't just keep the pawn chain solid, as it were. So White normally takes on d5, and you get this position here, where basically White has a bit of a initiative early with the extra development and so forth. But Black plays a6, just preparing to go e5 and kick the knight away, and it's not that easy for White to turn his advantage into something more tangible. The move Prague played at g3 and is playing in a Catalan style is the main line. But it's also a position that Nakamura is not fairly happy to play, just having a bit of extra space and fairly easy piece play to work with. Though you do have to be a little bit precise, like if you were to play something like bishop e6 and to just develop very automatically, for example. In a position like this, White is going to have pretty decent pressure. Like, you can play, for example, rook d1 and bishop g5 and really exploit some of the weak squares. So it's not like Black can just fall asleep at the wheel here by any means. Also even something like bishop e3 and putting a knight on c5 would also be a thing which would make Black's life a bit difficult as such. Again, a bit of an example of the space disadvantage like we saw in the Abasov game. But Black played the move a5 instead. It's clear that Nakamura had prepared this idea of using the rook's pawn to disrupt White's coordination a little bit. The move in the game, knight b5, is probably not the most critical way to play against this, where White should probably think about a move like bishop e3 and trying to coordinate the knights in a sense, like knight c5 or knight d2. Of course, true, Nakamura had prepared this with takes and like knight d4 or knight g4 with some decent play for the pawn in a sense. But anyway, this getting a little bit off topic. So in the game, White played a move of knight to b5, trying to exploit the outpost, but having bishop b4 check really makes things kind of easy. Bishop d2, king e7, just getting out of the knight c7 fork, and ensuring that the Black king is kind of a bit closer to White's in the center for the ensuing endgame. a4 just fixes the pawn in place, and already I think that this position is equal, but I think it's kind of more equal for Black, where Black just has more space, and it's kind of hard for White to really make something of the pressure down the long diagonal. The game went castles, rook d8, knight to e3. Knight e3 is a little bit of a curious retreat, but it's also true if you play a move like rook e1 or e3, like suggested by the engine, you're not really fighting for an advantage, let's say. But knight e3, yeah, just sort of clearing the way for the rook, I suppose. Black played the move rook a5 to kind of ask where the knight is going. And it's actually quite practically a good move, because the top line, the engine of knight c7 is not really the first move that most human players would think of. Because it looks like your knight's just trapped after the bishop moves, but computer, yeah, sort of finds a way to make it work and show that the knight is actually not getting lost in this position. But like I said, not a very human continuation, to put it mildly. In the game, White played bishop takes c6 and then knight c3, just trying to sort of leverage the isolated pawns, but the problem with that is that after bishop b3, it's just kind of hard for White to fight for the control over the d-file. White played a move knight b1, a nice move to hit the pawn and stop rook d2. Rook a6 was played, f4. You can make an argument either for taking or for playing e4, but in the game, Nakamura just kept things close with e4. White played king f2. It's all pretty standard so far. Like, neither side is really making any outright mistakes here. Rook b1. maybe not the most precise, but it's not like a losing move by any means. But, a move like g4 and grabbing some space definitely could also have been considered here. But the game went rook b1, knight d5, and white moved the rook back, kind of, admitting the mistake a little bit of putting the rook on b1, which maybe is a little bit prophylactic. So now black has a little bit of a better sort of space to work with. White played g4, which I think is a good reply. Just trying to make the pawn e4 a little bit weak, but it is true that you're also letting black take on f4 here. And here white has to be quite precise, actually, where if white plays correctly, he will be able to sort of get this pawn back, but it's not so easy, where what white has to do is he has to play to move king e1, not the most obvious move by any means, but with that hit after knight e6, you might be thinking that white will just take the pawn, but actually after rook d4, there are going to be some problems for white here. Like there's ideas like bishop d5 and hitting the knight and the pawn at once. And if you go knight ef2 to anticipate it, then there's like knight f4 and you're threatening mate. And yeah, white has actually is facing a pretty strong initiative in this instance. So white does have to be quite careful, like a move like knight to e5 is probably more the go, where white kind of waits for a better moment, let's say, to take the pawn and kind of equalize that way. But yeah, it's not simple by any means. Like white is having to find some pretty good moves as a result of the rook b1, rook c1 losing to tempi earlier. And then the game, Prague just collapsed under the pressure with king to e3, which looks natural to put the king in the center, but the problem is after knight d5, the king just ends up being a bit too exposed here. The machine really likes the idea of going c5 and bring the rook in the attack, but Hikaru's move game in knight c3 is also pretty good. We're after bc3. So rook c3 is not really a thing here, because bishop d5 and you just take the pawn next move. But after bc3, c5, like much like we saw in the last variation, like white has some quite real problems dealing with the attack on the king, and the bishop is also just a million times better than the knight here. The move rook f4 is not the best defense, but everything was kind of bad by this stage. Bishop d5, king e3, h5, very nice move to just run the white pieces out of the squares. If knight f2, we can just go rook e6, and I mean, knight e4, g5 is just winning material, and that's GG. So white plays the move c4 as an intermezzo, but bishop a8, and still the same problem arises. White played a move knight h6, trying to get out of this knight f2, rook e6 we saw before, but after knight h6, rook e6, the problem is that the knight is just trapped here on h6. Once that king gets to g7, the knight will be lost, and after king g3, rook h8, take, rook f1, king g7. Of course, knight f7, rook f8 is still going to win the knight because of the pin. And the game ended knight f5, take, and like as long as you keep at least one pawn alive as black, you're basically going to win it one way or the other. Black just improving his worst place piece, just hitting the weakness that's fixed in place. King e5, king g6, nice little precise move, just making it that, if they do move the rook to h3, you can kind of take and not have to worry about the pressure against the pawn. And because keep in mind that if you did have something like, say, king here and takes, like, if you trade here, it's already going to be a draw because of the wrong rook's pawn and bishop, as it were. So by playing king g6 first, you just kind of avoid that problem, where you're able to just get the pawn. And I think if it was a game like of a lesser sort of value, maybe white would just resign. But okay, it's a candidate. It's like you lose this game, you're basically giving up on any chance of winning the candidates. But yeah, Nakamura just played it perfectly. Rook d3, rook b3, and yeah, the pawn is just going to queen after c3, c2, c1. So white just resigned here. And yeah, obviously a very painful loss for Pragnananda, who kind of falls out of contention for the first place with this loss. Well, for Nakamura, quite an important win that sort of gets him back in the hunt in second place, tied with Gukesh on, I've got the exact number, but yeah, it's like +2, so 6.5 out of 11. Which leaves our final game between Vidit against Nepomniachtchi, really kind of the game of the round, you could say. Not just in terms of standings, because of course, with this win, Nepo now is in the outright lead, half point ahead of, Gukesh and Nepomniachtchi. But also the game could very easily have gone the other way. Like, it was a game where, white could very well have won in some cases. So let's see how it played out. Knight c4 earlier is a little bit of an unusual move compared to knight f3. But yeah, of course, you're not going to really get an advantage by force against the Petrov. It's just too good of an opening for that. So white's happy just to kind of get a creative position where there may be some hope to outplay the opponent. White played a move d4, just wanting to grab some space, and yeah, what we kind of see here is with bishop e6, we're just not kind of letting white play knight e3 and just sort of coordinate his pieces in a very harmonious way. Something like this could give white a little bit of an edge to work with, let's say, but with bishop e6, yeah, it disrupts a little bit. Because now moving the knight doesn't really make as much sense when you're giving up the a2 pawn, as it were. So white plays move a4 to prepare it. Castles, bishop e3, knight e3. You could just play a move like d5 if you're just happy with a draw here, and because the position is so symmetrical. But Nepo decides to keep some play in the position with the move bishop g5. Just keeping the pin to so it's a little bit awkward for white. We had c4, black played rook to e8, white played h4, kind of an alpha zero style, just kicking the bishop away with a tempo. Also, if you do play like bishop d6, and I can play even king d1, and so I make the point that the bishop could be a bit awkwardly placed in the future. Well, black played bishop f6 instead, and yeah, maybe c3 is not the most precise compared to developing with bishop b2, but in the game c3 is what was played. And I really like the next move Nepo played of c5, just putting the pressure on d4, fixing c4 as a weakness. It definitely gives the game very much a kind of Nimzo Indian sort of feel. And it's quite telling that white didn't even try to defend the pawn, like bishop b2. Turns out it can actually be met with knight c6, because if white plays d5 to fork, then black can hit the rook with a tempo and sort of take control in this sort of way as such. With like knight a5 and just already very awkward for white. So white goes bishop d3, sacking a pawn to try to turn things around. It is true, bishop e4 is also kind of a threat here. So black goes knight c6, which initially might look like a blunder, but black did play to move knight e5, counter-attacking the bishop. We had take, 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 take. So material is still equal, but black is the one who is pressing here due to having the more flexible pawn structure and slightly more active pieces. Note that black only has 2 pawn islands, while white has no less than 3 pawn islands. White played a move g4 in the game, trying to create some counterplay on the king's side. You could also make a decent argument for a5, just trading off white's extra pawn island as a way to kind of balance the play a bit. But in the game, white played g4 first, and only after grabbing a little bit of space on the king's side did he now play to move pawn to a5. So already things are getting kind of sharp. B takes a5. Flex up a pawn, but white's got some decent activity for it. Plus our extra pawn is doubled here as black. Black neutralized the pressure on the 7th rank with rook d7. We had take, take. Rook d1's a nice move by white, hitting the pawn on d6, which black defended. Knight g4. So white's playing with a nice energy, stopping knight b6 because of the knight f6 fork. And the bishop can also come to f4 to try to provoke some more weaknesses. So very much a position where even though the engine says equal, like all 3 results are still possible here. I like black's move here of rook b2, just throwing in an annoying check, getting that rook active with a tempo. e5, bishop to e3. And there are a lot of moves that kind of keep the balance here as black. I mean, a move like a4 and just meeting rook a1 with knight b6 would strike me as the most natural, but Nepo played knight b6 first, which is also perfectly fine. After knight f6, king to h8. I mean, if white gets a rook to h7 or g8, obviously it's mate, but it's kind of hard to actually get that here because the position is just so locked up. White brought his king to an active position with king e4. Also potentially thinking about playing a move like f4 or h5 at some point, but the a pawn is a little bit of a problem here, so white decided to play rook a1 to cover it. And this is actually the point where the game starts to get a little bit crazy from this stage. Because here what black has to do is he kind of needs to get the king into the game as quickly as possible. And so he should actually play to move king g7 and just try to get the king into the position ASAP. But maybe Nepo is concerned about something like h5 and king f5 where, white is sacrificing a pawn again, but he does have a rather strong passed g pawn, which, does look pretty scary. And actually, if it wasn't for the move knight c8 to kind of threaten a fork, then it would actually be very strong for white. But as it stands, it turns out that, according to the computer, that this is basically just going to be a draw here. But you have to be very precise. Like, you have to find rook b1 and, to support the advance of the pawn. And, yeah, very, very messy position, of course. in the game, Nepo played rook b3, which actually gives white a little bit of an opportunity here, where it turns out that the move h5 is actually very strong. Mainly because black actually can't take the pawn. If he takes, what happens is white can play king f5. And it doesn't even really matter how many pawns you take here as black, because the problem is that what's going to happen is white's just going to be threatening checkmate with rook h5 and rook h7. It's like if you take a pawn, it just doesn't really help here, like rook h5. And yeah, if you play king f7, it just doesn't do anything, like rook h7, g6, and, black is just getting killed here. Like bishop h6, and, you just give mate, essentially, as white. So white should have just gone for the jugular. Of course, we can see that, the time trouble was a little bit of a factor here, so maybe this is the reason why he played a move king to d3 instead. Nepo played a3, getting that passed pawn to be a bit more valuable, taking a little bit of sting out of h5, because now knight a4, and, white has to also factor in his own king safety a bit. But after king c1, at this point, once again, as black, you probably just have to play knight a4 and, just accept that, like, after rook a3, take, it's just going to be a draw here. Like, neither side really has a great way through the other's position, because, both bishops are kind of passive here. But in the game, a5 was played, and this should have been winning for white, technically, where d5 already feels a little bit kind of desperate here, But it turns out that actually white kind of blundered back in this position, and okay, maybe it's not fair to say blunder, because I have only a few moves left at time control and not much time left, let's say. But here white had to play either the non-obvious move of bishop c1 and, just going for rook a5 and the mate on h7. Or the, let's say, more direct solution is to play knight d5 and actually sacrifice the piece here, which might seem a little bit weird to go for this at first, but the point is that after king b5, like, white has these very strong passed pawns. They're actually really tough for the bishop to deal with. Like, let's say you play e4, for example. White will go c4. And already, like, if you get in c5, like, you're just queening the pawn, more or less. So, black kind of has to sacrifice a pawn with a4 to, try and get this blockade, which would be holding. But it turns out white can ignore it and play the move c5 himself. Where after, say, takes... Black's taking, because otherwise, you just kind of queen the pawn and, you're just faster than black in a way. But, after bishop c5 takes a4 free, we end up with this queen endgame where, white is a pawn up here. And he is about to kind of win a second pawn. Like, you can go queen e7 and take this guy at a good moment. And basically it's just going to be winning for white in this case with the extra pawn in tow. So that was really the answer. Like, knight d5, you sack the piece, but the two connected passed pawns will basically win you the game. Whereas after king c2, well, now black is kind of okay. Like, he's managed to keep things defended. Like, rook d1's not so effective because the bishop is on. So white, at this point, backtracks, plays the move knight e4. Black defends with rook b5. Rook d1, bishop e7, just not letting the white rook invade so easily. White played rook e1, king g7, and I think normally speaking this would end in a draw, but, the game goes on, of course, as I mentioned with some of the earlier games, like, the players by round 11 are starting to get a little bit tired, even with a rest stages beforehand. And in the game, white tries to create some chances, realizing that bishop d6, now it's in an h5, and you can't take back because of the fork. So black might not have a great way to defend the e5 pawn, but it turns out he also doesn't really need to, because rook b3 is a good counterattack. Bishop c1, knight d5, again going for the counterattack here. Rook e5 does run into rook c3. And we're going to have a check to make sure we're not just losing a piece in this case. So, or even just rook d3 directly, as it turns out. But knight e4 was played, king f7. Position is still dynamically equal here, but it's one where, white is down a pawn, but black's pawns are kind of a bit weak in a sense. So at rook b5, knight d2, rook a5. King b2 maybe is a small step in the wrong direction. Here maybe white should just play knight e4 and just kind of sit on the position, just say you have a fortress here. But I suppose maybe white was still trying to find a way to play for a win, and unfortunately for him, he kind of went a little bit too far, I guess, in his efforts. So king f5, f3, knight d5. So already, black is exploring ways to try to create some chances to make something of the extra pawn. White does take the pawn back. And still White has to be a little bit careful in this position. Like, the engine, says that this is just equal, but the little issue White faces is his king is on the edge of the board, and Black's pieces are actually coordinating very, very well here. So White has to be a little bit precise, and it turns out that he should probably play to move knight e5 here, and just move the rook away. Like, actually, it does matter a little bit where you move the rook, but like, as long as you move it to some reasonably sensible square, like, you are going to be fine here. Maybe Vidit was concerned about something like bishop d8 and the king kind of running down like this way, where it might feel like the king is somehow getting mated, but, after knight a7, it's just going to be a repetition of moves, not more than that. And Black doesn't really have better, because the pieces are also, the pawns are all just kind of getting hoovered off very quickly as well in such a position. So the game went bishop g3, which doesn't spoil things just yet, but it does make things a little bit more difficult. Maybe the easy way here is just to give up the piece temporarily, but say they're just going to play bishop e5, and I mean, it looks scary because it looks like this passed pawn should just win the game, but it turns out that you do have moves like h5 where you're sort of able to sacrifice a pawn, but basically like hoover everything off, like bishop d6, and win this pawn, pick up this guy, and hold the draw in that way. But yeah, in the game, White played king a3, keeping a bit more tension in the position. And after rook b4, again, White has to be very precise, where White has to basically play to move knight e5 in this position, and then play the move of rook g1, with the idea of maybe even not so much to take the pawn on g6 right away, but just being able to kind of annoy the black king. For example, c4 is threatening mate with rook b3, but when White is able to go bishop e1 and basically kind of like give up the exchange like this, then this will allow White to save the game with a very beautiful move of bishop to b4, which looks kind of suicidal at first, but the idea is that we want them to take with the bishop, so that when we get to this point that we're able to, basically pick off the c4 pawn, pick off the g6 pawn, and in a sort of fancy way we're basically able to save ourselves by just getting rid of these pawns and getting some rook versus knight position. I mean, I guess even king knight g6 does the job, because, yeah, king d3, knight e5 allows you to get rid of their last pawn and save the draw in that way. But we can see White had to be quite precise because of the challenging questions that Nepo posed in the game. And, well, once knight b2 is played, then it's all over, where after rook f1 and c4, there just isn't a good defense to the threat of rook b3 mate, where after rook f2, Black played the move of... You could also play king e3 here if you want and just win a piece that way, but the move Nepo playing game knight e2 is also winning, where the threat of pushing the c-pawn and taking advantage of this knight effectively being trapped on the thin-colored square is very, very strong. Game ended bishop e5, c3, rook f7 is kind of a desperation at this point. Rook b7, king a4, c2, and there's just no good way to stop the pawn queening after king knight c4, king d3. Knight b2, king e4, there's no good answer to c1 equals queen, or even just taking the bishop. And for this reason, Vidit resigned in this position. So a very exciting round of chess. 3 decisive games is always going to be a good time, let's say. And yeah, with this we see that now Nepo is in outright first place with 3 rounds to play, while we now have Gukesh and Nakamura in equal second, half point behind. And, I mean, if Gukesh had better tiebreaks than Nepo, I'd say it's still pretty close to a 50-50 between the two of them in their chances, just because Gukesh does still have a Barsov and Furusha to play, while Nepo's next opponent is going to be like Nakamura, Caruana, and one other player who I've forgotten now. Might be Prague who he's playing next, but yeah, but basically, like, even because it's like the fact that Nepo has a half point lead and also has the better tie breaks as well compared to Gukesh, as far as I know, and I think also Nakamura. Well, that kind of means that basically, like, it's going to be very hard, I think, for Gukesh or Nakamura to score 1 point more than Nepo. So at this point, we can kind of say that short of a complete and utter collapse, it's basically Nepo's tournament to lose, where probably 1.5 even is going to be enough for him to, to basically, like, just take the tournament at the very least on tie breaks. And yeah, essentially, we can sort of see that, yeah, Nepo's had some good luck in some games, it's true, by, like in this game he was losing at one point, but it's also he did kind of outplay Vidit later in the game as well, so it kind of evens out in that respect. And, it's also true, like, players like Gukesh, it's true he could have scored a lot better, but he also didn't really take advantage of the chances either that he got. So it's like, you do sort of have to take advantage of chances to sort of, win a tournament like this. But yeah, there's still 3 rounds to play, still anything can happen, and of course Nepo is the clear favourite. But yeah, we'll see how it goes in the last 3 rounds. Do comment below as well, like what was your favourite move or favourite game from this particular round. And yeah, I'll see you in the next recap for round 12, which will be, I think it'll be actually tomorrow, so that'll be cool to get into. Yeah, see you then and take care.